So Bitcoin as a system it's like you've got the merchants and the wallets, and then maybe you have some library code, and then you get down and down, you get to the actual Bitcoin mode, which is at the bottom of all of this infrastructure. And then in the Bitcoin mode, you have the network stuff and so on. But the core part of this is the consensus part.
And keep in mind, what I study about Bitcoin, for the most part, I only care about those lower levels. I don't really care that much about what merchants are doing. I don't really care that much about what their customers are doing. I mean, I do care that they use Bitcoin in ways that are secure.
Maybe explain a bit more about what this part of Bitcoin is and why it's...
Well, I care about the software. I care about the way the technology works. I'm not that interested in the financial environment around exchanges. I don't really care that much about the latest merchant API. None of that really matters much to me. I care about how do Bitcoin transactions happen? How do Bitcoin users use wallet software to go and make those transactions happen, and so on?
Well, what is the consensus part of Bitcoin?
Well, if you want to talk about the consensus part is the protocol. And the Bitcoin protocol is defined by a couple thousand lines of C++ source code. And that is the source code that Satoshi wrote.
You mean the network protocol?
No, I mean the Bitcoin protocol. Remember, the network protocol, I think you mean the way that blocks are passed around between nodes. That is not part of the Bitcoin protocol.
All right, so you mean the block validation and the scripting?
When we developers talk about the Bitcoin protocol, or at least when some of us developers talk about the Bitcoin protocol, we refer to the rules that decide whether or not a block is valid, and in turn, what is the state of the current blockchain, given the set of information you know about. And that protocol is defined by a few thousand lines of C++ source code. People often have this idea that this protocol is some specification based on something, or that the specification needs to be written. But the easiest thing to do is just say the specification is the small portion of the source code from the Bitcoin reference implementation as related to consensus.
And this is what makes Bitcoin.
Yes,
right?
That's exactly it.
And how does all the different Bitcoin versions work together?
Well, I think you got to understand that when it comes to the reference implementation on GitHub, /Bitcoin/Bitcoin, very little of the core consensus code has ever changed. For the most part, what has changed has either been cosmetic, such as adding printfs just to go and give debugging messages, or potentially moving a bit of code around or changing the indents, or stuff that we were really hoping wasn't important, like the level DB upgrade, which of course is a great example because we screwed it up and we ended up creating a hard fork. But in general, it doesn't change because it is the specification of what Bitcoin is.
Why is it important not to change it?
Because the moment you change it, the network can get out of consensus. And Bitcoin is unique in that consensus is a security issue. I mean, I like to use the analogy of, let's suppose you're in a crowd and you have a bag full of valuables, maybe, the Queen's jewels or something. And the only way to protect that bag is by holding onto it. Meanwhile, you have thieves trying to come in and grab that bag and steal the Queen's jewels. And you have to ask yourself, would you want everyone pulling in the same direction, trying to hold the bag in one place against the thief trying to steal it? Or do you want the consensus to break down over who is the thief and have people pulling against each other, making it much easier to overpower the strength of those who are trying to hold that bag, keep it secure? And in the case of Bitcoin, well, if nodes disagree about what is the Bitcoin blockchain, and especially if mining nodes disagree, you can have work done that is not in consensus, creating a fork, and then attackers can go and use the fact that work was not done in consensus to go create transactions that appear to have confirmed but haven't. And from that, of course, then you can go steal money from people. You've destroyed what Bitcoin is supposed to be, a secure way of determining whether transactions have actually happened or not.
So the consensus code, it needs to be the same between nodes, or the nodes need to operate in a deterministically singular way.
Yes.
How much can this code deviate? You gave the example of the level DB upgrade, which caused a fork.
We're at the level where even if people run the exact same code, deviations still can happen because the execution environment, the computer that the code runs on, isn't always exactly the same, which I think should give people a sense of how hard it is to make sure consensus is maintained. I have never seen an alternative implementation from the ground up that has even come close to getting it right. The ones that you do see, you find bug after bug after bug where it doesn't quite match the semantics. And it may even be that they fixed the bug. But in Bitcoin, fixing a bug is not fixing anything. It's breaking the consensus. You must implement Bitcoin exactly the same way as everyone else does, or you risk breaking consensus. And, it's a very tough barrier, and I don't think computer science is at a point where we can re-implement Bitcoin and get it right. Now, you can certainly change all the stuff around that consensus code. You have completely different wallets, you have completely different rules for how transactions are relayed from one node to the other. But when you receive a block, you must perform the exact same actions to determine whether or not the block is real as everyone else does.
They say in software development, there's never any software without any bugs in it.
Yes.
And so do you think that in the consensus code that there are bugs in there that we don't know about that need to be replicated, that may be alternative?
Absolutely. And that's what's so hard about replicating Bitcoin. Every time I go spend some time looking at the code in detail, it seems I find another thing I didn't know about before. And people underestimate just how complex a few thousand lines of source code can be when you have to match its behavior exactly.
Right, so the problem is not a few thousand lines of code is not a difficult thing.
Yes.
It's relatively easy.
Yeah.
You're making the argument that it's not that we have to write a couple of thousand lines of code. It's that those couple of lines of code must perform very singularly.
Yes.
In its functionality.
And what's interesting about that is to write Bitcoin is easy. If you want to implement an altcoin, or if you were the person who implemented Bitcoin in the first place, writing that code is not that hard, because what it does is actually pretty simple. But when you want to write a bug-for-bug compatible reimplementation, that's just a nightmare. It's incredibly hard.
And how about how Satoshi made Bitcoin?
There's a lot of suspicion that Satoshi wasn't even a programmer. Because frankly, the Bitcoin source code sucks. Bitcoin was very badly made. Bitcoin used software development practices that were awful, but it worked well enough. And early in its history, some bugs were fixed and last-minute changes. And what we have is what we have. So we have to go deal with what we have and work from there.
And is Bitcoin the future of our financial infrastructure, global financial infrastructure?
I would suspect no. I would suspect that we would go see lessons learned from Bitcoin applied to more conventional financial infrastructure, because Bitcoin's a very unforgiving system. Bitcoin has no ability to be fixed other than by convincing everyone to go fix something when an issue comes up.
You think that's solvable?
No.
It's maybe with an alternate coin, would that be solvable? Would it be possible even?
Yeah, but an alternate coin is going to go look like the current financial system, where by human intervention you can make it do anything you want.
Right, with human intervention.
Yes.
But then that's not Bitcoin, is it really?
Whereas Bitcoin says, no, there is no human intervention other than everyone agreeing.
Right.
And I think in reality, for most purposes, that's too strict. In most examples will not want to deal with that.
Why do you think that? It's too strict?
Well, it's quite simple. When people make mistakes, they want to have the ability to have those mistakes fixed.
Right.
The legal system's really good at this. The legal system can make anything happen. I love using the example of hundreds of years ago when various treaties were made between, I'm not even going to say what term I'm going to use, but the people who came to the New World and made treaties with the people who already lived there. And even 300 years later, those treaties are getting ripped up and redefined and modified because it was decided that they were not just and they needed to be modified. Whereas in a Bitcoin system, that would be impossible without having every single person who used the system agree to make the change. All you have to do to rip up a treaty from 300 years ago is convince maybe a dozen judges. But to go change something in Bitcoin requires thousands.
What do you think of BitShares and Mastercoin and other proposals like these ones?
I don't think they're as interesting as Bitcoin itself.
What's interesting about Bitcoin?
That it is money, and that it is something of value without any reference to anything in the real world. On the other hand, colored coins, Mastercoin, so much other stuff like it, they're really just accounting systems based on central identities. Fundamentally, a colored coin is only as valuable as the thing that it was issued by. And while it's certainly very interesting that you can go create an accounting system for shares that is independent of the company, It's not as interesting as creating something out of thin air that's valuable with no ties to a real world identity. And I certainly don't want to go put down colored coins. It's a fascinating experiment, but it's not as fascinating as Bitcoin itself.
BitShares, they want to create an alternate blockchain that gives them like all the power to like create all these different concepts that you can't do with Bitcoin. Whereas things like Mastercoin or colored coins wants to leverage the blockchain and use all the existing mining power and momentum that's behind Bitcoin to fuel their technologies. Which do you think is the better approach? Or is there no better?
Absolutely, Mastercoins and colored coins. No, trying to go create your own blockchain from scratch for your own purpose is crazy. Mastercoin is embedded in Bitcoin. Colored coins is embedded in Bitcoin. And that means that you get the security of Bitcoin because you're embedded within it. Whereas if you try to go create a blockchain from scratch for your own purpose, it only has as much security as people are willing to throw away money mining it, which is likely not very, very much, therefore it's not secure.
If a tool has a lot of economic incentive for people to use it, maybe it could drive the adoption of a new blockchain.
No. No, because it has to get to the level of incentive that is secure very quickly or it will be attacked. But until it gets to that point, it's not secure, therefore there's no incentive to use it.
So why was Bitcoin so lucky?
Because it got lucky.
Right.
That's all it comes down to. Bitcoin could have been killed off early on, but we were lucky enough that it didn't. In some respects, it could still be killed off. And maybe 100 years from now, we're going to be able to say, well, we were pretty damn lucky it didn't.
So it seems pretty inevitable that the blockchain is going to be used and abused, and people are going to build all kinds of different applications leveraging off of it. It's a new concept or a new data structure in computer science which we haven't fully investigated, and the Bitcoin one is the one that's there, and you can start putting stuff inside it. So Bitcoin is struggling right now with the blockchain. Already it's becoming a problem that as it's becoming more resource intensive, we're having to think, okay, how can we make it more easier for people to run it?
The thing is, Bitcoin isn't becoming more resource intensive in the way that matters. And the way that matters is how much bandwidth it takes to keep up with the blockchain. And that bandwidth is fixed. And if we keep the block size limit, it cannot be more than 1 megabyte approximately every 10 minutes.
Also, write speeds.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant. You have 1 megabyte of data approximately every 10 minutes. That amount is fixed, and the problem stays the same. Now, certainly you have a large amount of data to sync up if you wish to sync up from block zero. But we already have very good handle on how to make cryptography that doesn't require that to be done. We know how to solve that problem. What we do not know how to solve is how to make the block size bigger without risking a disaster. There's certainly some approaches that seem pretty promising, like the sharding stuff, but equally I can tell you that the people who looked at that think that to go make sharding the blockchain work requires different economic incentives than Bitcoin currently has. On the other hand, the economic incentives behind Bitcoin are broken anyway. And what that really comes down to is in Bitcoin, in the long run, security gets paid for by transaction fees. But the security is needed by everyone who owns Bitcoin. And unfortunately, the inflation rate of Bitcoin approaches zero in the long run. It does go to zero in the long run. So at some point, that inflation rate will become too low to by itself support enough mining hashing power to keep Bitcoin secure. Maybe transaction fees will go pick up the slack. Maybe they won't. And if they don't, we're screwed. Maybe it'll take 20 years, maybe it'll take 10, maybe it'll take 100, I don't know. But it's pretty easy to go see that declining curve will hit a point where there's not enough incentive to mine, and the whole thing collapses.
What are the most important topics that we have to research into the blockchain to investigate?
I would say scalability. I would say figuring out how to go make mining.
Scalability in what way? Because you said
just scalability in general.
I mean,
it's a huge aspect. But
you mean for reading the blockchain, for instance, yeah? Or for writing
for all these things. Maybe out of that subset, the most important thing is making sure it's always possible to mine in a scalable way.
But you said it was a solved problem in the beast. One was bandwidth, right?
Right, but as I say, syncing up old history to attain a decent level of trust in old history, that's a solved problem. or at least we think it is. We haven't implemented the solution yet.
Right. So it's taking these concepts and applying them.
Yes, but solving the problem of making the block size bigger, that is not something we know how to solve, other than solutions like off-chain transactions, which just dodges the shit.
Yeah.
And it certainly dodges in a very nice way. But for the consensus system of Bitcoin, it does not solve the issue.
Yeah, off-chain transactions loses the record, the fact that you have a recorded entry in the blockchain.
Well, off-chain transactions just means that rather than relying on consensus of everyone, you rely on consensus of a very small group where you trust some central service.
You think Ripple could provide something like that?
Sure, but Ripple relies on trust in small, in groups of people. It is not the same sort of model as Bitcoin. Now, the thing with off-chain transactions is you can go use a lot of clever cryptography and other tricks to create systems where you can trust third parties with your money and put those third parties in positions where if they run off with your money, they will actually end up with less return than otherwise. But what you can't do is make it impossible for those third parties to not do some harm to you. It's not like Bitcoin where you can make it impossible for a third party to do anything to you.
Do you think that by thinking more about these fundamental problems in Bitcoin rather than, new merchant solutions or different Bitcoin, websites or payment gateways, this is really a more fundamental area to invest our energy in? And would putting resources into solving these problems help also the merchants and the wallet users?
I think this is just a standard long-term, short-term investment thing. You should do both. But the main thing is to go and accept that thinking about long-term issues is important. And unfortunately, we have some members of the Bitcoin community who think that long-term issues aren't important. And I think what's important is to go say to those, members of the community that they're short-sighted. It's as simple as that. And equally, when someone does come up with some clever new merchant API or some nice new wallet software, I'm not going to put them down for it. They're doing good work. And chances are they're the sort of people who will do good work in that field. And I'm the sort of person who will do good work in my analysis field of long-term thinking. And that's totally fine.
Working this kind of thing like off-chain transactions or blockchain scalability or so on, how can this impact the people doing the merchants solutions or the users of the wallets?
Well, the immediate impact is that if problems in these fields aren't solved in some way or another, and that includes being solved by, compromises and quick hacks, you wind up with people increasingly are not able to go and use Bitcoin for very small value transactions. But I don't see that as a big issue, given that it's very easy to see that most of what Bitcoin's used for is as an investment. And the way you know this is true is you just take all the money that must flow into Bitcoin to keep the price stable, given the inflation rate, and you divide it by the number of transactions. Currently, each transaction costs about $30. And it was spiked up to, I think, $50, maybe. Actually, no, it's probably true. It probably is about $50 right now. And $50 is much, much, much more expensive than anything that average person's going to use Bitcoin for to make a small purchase. On the other hand, it's not very expensive in terms of being able to go and transfer value around the world with no intermediaries and with no ability to block. Wire transfer between arbitrary banks around the world tends to be about $50. And for someone investing in Bitcoin as an asset that cannot be confiscated, $50 a transaction doesn't necessarily pose much of a problem.
Bitcoin is as a new fundamental primitive of trade, economic tool of business, inevitably create new markets that didn't exist before. What is the potential that hasn't yet been realized of Bitcoin that could become a reality? What are the really interesting applications or possibilities to maybe things that will undermine or power structures or things that will improve people's lives in a fundamental way? What are the things that you really think is interesting about Bitcoin?
Well, I could go and name various pieces of technology that haven't been fully developed. But I think the most interesting thing still boils down to the fact that you have a way of storing wealth that cannot be confiscated. That is really fundamental. Anything else can either be confiscated by simple decree, as in your bank account is frozen, or it can be confiscated by physical force. Bitcoin is digital, yet it cannot be confiscated by decree. And that is absolutely fundamental to what Bitcoin is. It only is possible because Bitcoin is decentralized. And that is something that no other system comes close to providing.
Nothing else in the world.
Yeah, nothing else in the world.
And how will that change things? Why is that important?
Well, it changes things in so many ways because it changes what politicians and what governments can do. Whereas all the other stuff that Bitcoin can enable, things like, low-cost payments, things like identities on the internet that, are artificially made expensive. I mean, all that stuff, there's other ways to do that. But a store of value that can't be confiscated, there aren't any other ways to do that.
But what are some of the practical things that
I told you practical things. People who are able to go and store wealth that cannot be confiscated. That's a very practical purpose.
Yeah, but what would I see out of that? Would it collapse the governments or the banks or?
Why would it collapse anything?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
It gives people options. It makes it much easier for them to go take action, say, against the government, knowing that they'll have something to fall back on.
Right.
It returns power back to those who are able to go and have some money stocked away. I'm not going to say it returns power back to the people. That's not true. I'm going to say it returns money back to the people who are in a position where storing wealth will be useful for them.
Excellent. Thanks.
You're welcome.
More than 300,000 users and counting trust blockchain.info. It's a Bitcoin wallet service and a wealth of Bitcoin information, and is completely free to use. With a blockchain.info wallet, you'll get the convenience of a web wallet and the security of a desktop client. Blockchain.info is also a block explorer. You can use it to see Bitcoin transactions in real time, check the balance of any Bitcoin address, and view many handy Bitcoin charts, all for free. See what they have to offer today at blockchain.info.